To this special Sunday at 9, which is dedicated to Remembrance Sunday, which in many ways is our Sunday. Tonight's program will be hosted by the Reverend Cole Maynard, retired, but the Deputy Chaplain of all the UK Armed Forces, and who is the Senior Pastor at Colchester Baptist Church. Tonight's edition will be a longer one, but it's worth every minute of our listening as we offer the relevant hymns interspersed by various stories, all from the front line. This program will begin with a 5-minute reflection by our guest host tonight. So please join us and listen along.
Well, thanks to Phil for inviting me to be involved in your Hymns at 9 today. This is a very important day in the life of anyone who served in the military because it's, of course, Remembrance Sunday. Different from Armistice Day, which will happen on the 11th, the 11th hour of the 11th, when the guns actually fell silent. But for people who have served in the military, who are veterans of conflicts and of the war, have a very real sense in which this Sunday is our Sunday, in which we have an opportunity to remember those who have fallen. And the reason we do that is not because we love war, far from it. No one who's been in a war, and trust me, no one who's been in a war really loves a war. You need to be a psychopath to love a war. War is quite horrendous. Both at Waterloo, Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, said the one thing worse than actually winning a battle is losing a battle. Basically, the consequences on your psyche, on your spirit, are pretty much the same, because war is a horrible, horrible conflict. But there's a price for peace. Peace doesn't come cheap. And we as Christians, of course, believe that, because the central emblem of the Christian faith is the cross. It's a symbol of execution. But for God to achieve peace with us, the Son of God, his most precious, beloved child, dies in our place. And that whole picture of sacrifice is what we remember on this particular Sunday, Armistice, Remembrance Sunday. Because war is an evil. It's an evil, and it's sometimes a necessary evil that we get involved with, because it's a means to bring about peace. We don't seek to be in war to expand the boundaries of the geographical area of our nation. That would be wrong. We get involved in war to restore peace and to bring peace to those who have lost it for whatever reason. I'm a great fan of C.S. Lewis, and of course C.S. Lewis himself, the famous professor from Magdalen College in Oxford, he was in the First World War as a lieutenant, and he was very badly wounded. He had a piece of shrapnel that was in his chest and so close to his heart they couldn't remove it, and he carried that for the rest of his life, having been wounded during the First World War. He was wounded in the Battle of Arras, that very famous battle. And he did a series of lectures during the Second World War for the Royal Air Force. And they were later on brought into this brilliant book called Mere Christianity, that I really encourage you to read. But in this, he writes about war, and he says, does not loving your enemy mean not punishing him? He says, no, for loving myself does not mean that I ought to subject myself, ought not to subject myself to punishment, even to death? And then he goes on and says, it is therefore, in my opinion, perfectly right for a Christian judge to sentence a man to death, or a Christian soldier to kill an enemy. But what he says is really important, is that we never allow that conflict to become something that we long. It's a detestable thing that you do in order to achieve a greater good. So later on he writes in this book, he says, therefore, what really matters is those little marks or twists on the central inside part of the soul, which are going to turn in the long run into a heavenly or a hellish creature. We may kill if necessary, but we must not hate and enjoy hating. We may punish if necessary, but we must not enjoy it. And what Lewis is saying there is that sometimes as Christians, we have to walk in that dark grey area of life where we do unpleasant things, but for a greater good, because that's what a requirement of us is. And of course, we mustn't forget that when the Lord returns, he comes as a victorious force to conquer the evil in this world. And it will be, as C.S. Lewis writes about in that famous series on Narnia, the last battle, in which evil and death will be defeated upon a battlefield. So war is a necessary evil at times, and it's not something that people enjoy. And in fact, we have so many veterans and young men and young women and old men and old women experiencing what we call post-traumatic stress disorder as a reality of damage to their mind and to their spirit caused by war. This is why it's really important to remember people, to remember that price. Many people carry on paying it, even in times of peace, either through physical injury or through mental or moral injury that's been caused in that conflict. So it's only right that we begin this time of singing hymns to sing as our first hymn on this subject, Dear Lord and Father of mankind, forgive our foolish ways.
Dear Lord and Father of mankind, forgive our foolish ways. Improve us in our rightful mind, in pure Christ thy service kind, redeem our reverence ways.
One of the things that I learned very quickly as become a chaplain. I served for 25 years in the military, 4 years in the Royal Air Force as a young man, where I came back to faith, having abandoned my faith in the early years of my military service, came back to the Lord, and the Lord called me into ministry through serving in the Royal Air Force. I went straight from serving in Germany, RAF Loughborough, and went straight across to Scotland and studied at my first Bible college for 3 years up in Glasgow. And one of the things that I learned very quickly when I came back into the army as an army chaplain, and I served for 21 years, was the need for a strong prayer life. You can't minister out of a dryness. You know, in a lot of my service, I've served twice in Iraq and twice in Afghanistan. These are deserts. The only way you can minister in a desert is if you've got a really strong, healthy, vibrant prayer life and strong spirituality. If you're going to exist in the desert, you've got to have nourishment. And spiritually, you've got to have nourishment. So you need a strong prayer life and a vital spirituality. And one of the sadnesses, in one sense, of coming back from military operations is that, you know, that excitement of operations and the conflict you're going through and the vitality of your faith is easier. It's easier to be a Christian back in peacetime, and you know, when people aren't shooting you or trying to blow you up. And you can find that you begin to take the Lord for granted, and your faith begins to grow a wee bit cold. And the great thing about military, being a Christian in the military, is that it keeps you close to the Lord. You need the Lord so much to exist and to thrive in that environment. And one of the joys as a chaplain has been leading young men and women back to the Lord whose faith has grown cold, or leading them to the Lord who've never known the Lord. And the last baptism I carried out in operations was in Afghanistan in 2011, the night before I came back on my R&R, which is a wonderful occasion, in Bastion for a young corporal. Wonderful opportunities as people begin to explore the reality of life and death when they're in a conflict zone, and they realize that their life could possibly end in the next few weeks or months. So you need that really strong faith. We need to trust him, and we need to have a faith that's kind of where you have this conversation constantly with the Lord. And one of the things I used to love doing on operations was, as soon as I opened opened my eyes, first thing in the morning, I would say, "Hi, Lord, good to be with you again." And I'd always, it's as a critical thing to do during that day, make a priority for my quiet time. And my last operational tour was in 2017 with the United Nations in South Sudan. And there'd been a civil war going on there for many, many years. And I was very privileged because I had my own room. So I was able, in that environment, to have a really special time with the Lord every day, reading scriptures and praying, and also reading a theological book to stretch me theologically every day. And it was really a vital time. In that kind of environment, you've got to depend upon God. He is your shield and your defender. And so we're going to sing that now. We rest in thee, our shield and our defender.
We go not far alone. come, our shelter from the stormy blast, and our eternal home. Under the shadow of thy throne, still may we dwell secure. Sufficient is thine arm alone, and our defense is sure. Before the hills in order stood, or earth received her frame, from everlasting thou art God, to endless years the same. O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come. Be thou my guide while life shall last, and our eternal home.
I love the Psalms. One of the things I love about the Psalms is that a lot of them written by a soldier called King David of Jerusalem. He was a down-to-earth man. He didn't start off with a silver spoon in his mouth. He was a shepherd boy. He'd learned his craft in being a warrior, actually fighting the bear and the lion using a sling. And the Hebrew shepherd boys were famous for their great skill. In fact, the early artillery for the Hebrew army was in fact their slings. So we may, when we hear about Goliath being slayed by 5 small stones, we may be shocked by that, but literally it was a weapon of choice for the shepherd boy, and they were highly skilled. And if you get a small rock between your eyes, trust me, it will hurt if not kill you. And so they were greatly skilled in this. And David was a man who was so small, when he went up against Goliath, he couldn't even fit the king's royal armor. He had to totally depend upon the Lord. He went there in his shepherd's clothes with a small sling and those 5 small pebbles in which to slay a giant. And he writes the Psalms in a way which is so real, because what I love about the Psalms is they're not just hymns of praise, they're hymns of sorrow, hymns of pain. He articulates wherever he is, he's honest with God, and God can cope with your honesty. He knows what you're thinking anyway. So, pretending that you don't feel bad is not going to conceal your badness from God. God knows you don't feel good. He knows when you're scared. And so articulating that in prayer is really quite important. And I love on operations, reading a psalm a day, and I'm really vigorous about this. I read a psalm a day, go all the way through the Psalms. Obviously, when you get Psalm 119, you can't read that in one day, so you read it, you serialize it. But an average tour is 6 or 7 months as an operations, so it gives you plenty of time to read a psalm a day, and you go up and down with the Psalms. And that's what I love about this, the rawness and the way that they articulate the emotional state of this warrior soldier called King David. One of the things about being in that kind of combat environment is that you can't control things. That they say that the plan of battle goes to pot with the first bullet that's fired. You can make all your plans, but in reality, when you come into war and into a battlefield, it's chaos, and you can control that chaos to a very limited degree. But it depends on so much that happens. It depends on what actually the outcome of the battle. And many, many years ago, I served with the Paras. I was with the Free Para in the Second Gulf War in 2003. And one of the great heroes of the Parachute Regiment was a guy called Bruce Keeble. And he was a major, devout Catholic guy. And he was there on the Falklands conflict as for 2IC, the second in command, when he received over the radio the fateful words, "Sunray is down, Sunray is down." And Sunray was the colonel, the CO, commanding officer. And Colonel Jones had been shot by a sniper's bullet while leading a charge to try and move the battle on, had been killed by that bullet. And suddenly Bruce Keeble, a major, was in charge of the regiment. And that evening, they managed to push the regiment forward. They only had 400 men by this stage, managed to push forward onto the ridge and took the ridge overlooking Goose Green. And by this stage, they've been up for around about 40 to 50 hours. The guys were cream crackered and, tired. They were really in a situation where they basically had to leave most of their warm kits in San Carlos Bay. So they'd tabbed, which is technical advance of battle, wearing the clothes they were in. And obviously when they're tabbing, they're working really hard, so they're really hot. But as soon as you stop tapping, your sweat dries on you, you get cold very quickly. They had no winter gear. It was blowing flurries of snow all the way up on that ridge looking up on Goose Green. They'd completely run out of mortar shells. They'd almost out totally of ammunition. And they're looking out on Goose Green, and there were about 400 of them. They'd lost 1 in 6, either killed or in casualties during that battle. And we looked out on Goose Green, and it was an airfield, and they were outnumbered 3 to 1. And the artillery Argentinians had ACAT guns, which had levelled down to use horizontally against ground troops. So it was fearful. They had no mortars. They couldn't take these weapons out. And around the burning of the gorse and the heather, they sat in the command group. So it was Bruce Keeble with the other majors, the company commanders. And he said to him, "What are we going to do, Bruce? What are we going to do?" And he said, "I don't know. I just don't know." He says, "Give me a few moments. I need to collect my thinking. I need to think about this." So he walked away from the burning fires and walked off onto the hill for a few moments. And he was praying. He didn't know what to do. And he was saying, "God, what do I do?" And as he was walking and praying, he suddenly felt something hard in his pocket, and he remembered it's a prayer by a French nobleman called Sir Charles de Foucauld. And he poured it out, this laminated cut prayer he always carried with him. And he prayed this prayer, and I've got a copy of it here. And this is the prayer he prayed. If I can find it. Give me a second. Need to cut that bit, Phil? I've got the wrong piece of paper, that's right. Oh, dear. Right. So he prayed this prayer by St. Charles de Foucauld, and the prayer is this: "My Father, I abandon myself to you. Do with me as you will. Whatever you may do with me, I thank you, providing your will is fulfilled. I ask for nothing more." And Bruce Keeble, he knelt down in the heather and the gorse on the side of that mountain, and he prayed that prayer. And as he got up, he says that like an inspiration, suddenly he knew what to do. A great calmness came upon him, a great sense of warmth came upon him. And he walked back into that command group and said, "What we're going to do? What we're going to do?" And he says, "We're going to negotiate the surrender of Goose Green." And they were flabbergasted. Their gasp was flabbered. They said, "Negotiate the surrender? We're outnumbered. They've got more, 3 to 1. They've got more weapons." He says, "We are going to negotiate the surrender." And so they captured a couple of Argentinian prisoners during the conflict, and he went and got 2 of them, and he gave them a briefing and said, "I want you to go down now to the camp and tell them that I'm going to come down in the morning at 8 o'clock. And if they come out I will take the surrender of Goose Green." And so those prisoners went down to the airfield and the Argentinian camp, and they've been there for 6 weeks. They're well dug in defensive position. And they explained this to the commander. And that morning, the following morning, when Bruce Keeble came down the hill, sure enough, the commander came out. He gathered his men around, and he handed his revolver and surrendered Goose Green to Bruce Keeble. That's trusting in God. They thought that he was a madman. "Bruce, you cannot negotiate the surrender." But God had told him that's what he needed to do, and that's what he did. And to God's glory, they took Goose Green without a further casualty and without a further loss of life. The next hymn is a beautiful hymn. It says, "I look to the hills." We don't look around for other people to help us. In times of trouble, we look to the hills. We don't find the help on the hills. So what do we look to? We look to the creator of the hills, God, our Father. And that's exactly what Bruce Keeble did. And that's what we need to do. even at times like this, in this pandemic, when we have no control over what's going on. We don't look to the hills, we look to our Creator. Our final hymn is a hymn that actually I love, and yet it's a hymn, sadly, we don't often sing very often. In fact, we tend to reduce this hymn to just the funerals. It's a real pity because the words are quite wonderful, and it is that wonderful hymn, Abide With Me. Fast falls the evening tide. And I love this hymn. I love the tune to it, but I love it because it's saying, God, I need you. Be here with me. And it's a great favourite hymn of the Parachute Regiment. One of the reasons for this is because it was really popular during the Battle of Arnhem. You've probably seen the film A Bridge Too Far, and it comes out in that film. But The Bridge Too Far is an incredible example of great courage and heroism. And they were the Parachute Regiment were actually instructed to hold the bridge at Arnhem for 48 hours. And in fact, they held it for twice that. And the failure in the Battle of Arnhem was for the armoured column to punch its way through Holland and make the actual bridge to provide the support they need. Because when paratroopers are jumped into a DZ, you're just like infantry. You can't jump out of a parachute. Jump out of an aircraft with a tank. You jump in light scales, and so you land on that airfield, and you've got your webbing and your weapons. You've got your weapons and your ammunition, and that's all you have. You have a very light ability to take on anti-tank, and then that's it. And there was 2 divisions of SS. Two SS tank divisions in Arnhem that they were unaware were there, and they were 2 divisions trained especially in combating airborne assault, and that's what they had to face. And they held that bridge for 4 days, 4.5 days in fact, before eventually they had to surrender. And there's many really profound books written about Arnhem from a Christian perspective. There's this really great book called The Torn Horizon, which is written about the paratrooping padres for chaplains that served in that particular arena. One of them, Father D. McGowan, was a hero because he was at the end of the battle, he was captured, and chaplains technically we're not allowed to be taken as POWs. We can't be taken prisoner. We surrender ourselves to look after our troops. That's part of the Geneva Convention. And so Danny basically went back out constantly, wearing his dog collar and his battle dress, onto the battlefield, recording the locations where the soldiers, the paratroopers have fallen, burying them, getting a good reference, and then he kept on getting arrested. There was SS out on the battlefield, there was some Gestapo, and he went out there sometimes with a medical orderly, sometimes with a local Dutch boy who spoke very good German, but often he'd be arrested, and then he would basically get taken into custody and eventually released back into the POW, and then he'd go out again and do the same. And he was responsible for providing the grid references of the bodies that now make up the Oosterbeek War Cemetery. And at the end of the war, he came back to Arnhem, and they exhumed all the paratroopers that had died, and they were then removed and put into the very famous Oosterbeek War Cemetery. A really courageous man. You can read about him and many others and their life in this particular book. And one of the things he says there is that in the hospital and particularly around the piano, when they basically were waiting for the Germans to come and take them prisoner, they were singing "Abide with Me" as that hymn. There's another great book written by General Sir John Hackett, and that's called "I Was a Stranger." And he was a Christian, and he was taken as a POW in hospital. He has a very bad stomach wound, and he was masquerading as a corporal, and eventually he was able to escape later on. And he was then found by the Dutch resistance helped him to escape, and they placed him in a home among Christians. And so he every morning they used to wake up and do a quiet time together as a family, and he'd sit there with his English Bible as they prayed and read their Dutch Bibles. And he writes about how during his convalescence, when he was trying to get well after his wound, how he found the spirituality of this home really risking their lives, because if they'd actually, the Germans, they had a German garrison just around the corner. They had German soldiers constantly marching past. He was actually pretending to be a dumb cousin who couldn't speak because he couldn't speak Dutch. He speaks so much of the courageous sacrifice and the risk that family took to look after him. And eventually their son, their 14-year-old son, and he get on 2 bicycles, and they cycle off down beside the Rhine, and eventually get to a pre-arranged place where he's picked up by British forces and taken by boat back to the British side. incredible stories of Christians risking their lives sacrificially in order to bring about the liberation of their country and the defeat of a horrible, evil regime. The last words of Arnhem, the last words spoken from General Urquhart's headquarters, was simply this: out of ammunition, God save the King. At that point, the paratroopers had no more ammunition to throw at the enemy. They were done, and they'd done their duty by the King and by their God. And they waited for the Germans to come and to take them prisoner. And as I said earlier on, as they did that, some of them gathered around a piano, and this is recorded, and they sang the hymn, Abide With Me.
Thank you very much for staying the journey with us. But before you retire, a benediction from way back in the Old Testament. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious unto you. And the Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace, not only tonight, but throughout the month of November and the rest of your lives. God bless.